you really, I think you were one of the people that helped me start moving away from Neo-Advaita and realizing that I didn't have to lose myself and I didn't have to stop being a person in order to experience non-dual consciousness. And when I read some of the words on your website, it was, you just exuded that poignancy and such beauty and love just from your words. And you were talking about a lot of the same things, but you allowed the self to be a sacred part of all of this. And it was like, whoa, wait, this is non-duality and I can be a person again. And I think I cried when I first read some of the things on your website. And having you here, you've written so prolifically about Neo-Advaita in a way that I've never seen anyone do before. And I was wondering if you ever were involved in Neo-Advaita, or you just became aware of it and were like, wait a minute, this is not right.
Yes, people would coming to the satsangs I would host for free over the decades and emailing me from around the world because of the website. I finally put up lots and lots and lots of materials. Put up that website, I think in 2006. So people would report these horrific kind of encounters with these abusive, all enlightened ones. They were not enlightened by any stretch of the imagination. You can smell it real fast. You can smell what is real freedom. And sense the real fragrance of wholesomeness, true holiness.
Yeah.
The beings who've authentically realized the omnipresent, unborn, undying, glorious, supremely virtuous, true identity, the divine identity. The beings that realize this, there's a holiness and wholesomeness and wholeness and completeness. It's not some character haranguing you for association with personhood or browbeating you and all there are these nasty tricks of the trade that one learns just about dysfunctional cult leaders, be they religious, pop psychology, political, cult leaders. They know all the tricks of like how to get one up on a fellow human being by making that other human being feel needy, lacking, not whole, and needing you, the big cheese, the big kahuna, the big leader to save them or fill them. Or so, you see this with little children on a playground. There's beings that bring in what the Buddha in ancient India called the asura energy, the demon or titan energy. And it's all about power and control. One-upping, the one-upsmanship games, as it's called.
Yeah.
And they use language in insidious ways. They literally will adopt intimidating body language. I got a lot of teeth,
Yeah,
some of the televangelists.
A lot of aggression, I realize.
Yeah, all the aggression. It goes back to sociobiology, and looking at different species, like when two dogs meet in a park or on the beach, they very quickly have ways of establishing the dominance hierarchy.
Right.
Human beings do this as well. And once you've learned to see it, and my background is in psychology,
right,
along with the spirituality that dawned so profoundly when I was about 16, after I'd just been kind of a sports addicted jock for the first years of my life. Yeah, well, from around age 6 to 16.
Oh, wow.
So my dad was a big sportsman, and I loved sports, and he loved it, I loved it, and we played, and all my buddies at school and in the neighborhood were totally addicted to sports: football, baseball, basketball, we did golf, swimming, competitive swimming. So that was my religion that I breathed. But then one day God just woke me up. No drugs, no nothing. Just I began to contemplate what is the no-thingness out of which God creates the universe. What is God beyond the kind of parochial notion of the Trinity that Christians grow up with? What is God? What does God create the universe out of? It must be out of God's self, God's source, substance, power, Shakti, Shekinah is the Hasidic Kabbalistic.
That's right, yeah.
So that dazzled me. And then I felt very ill. I had strep throat, couldn't participate in my normal world of sports and school, and hanging out with buddies and so forth. And being kind of stripped that way just emptied me out even more. What is the no thingness? And it just dawned one afternoon, just like lightning bolts, that we're all made of the divine awareness, power, light, love. And so the word reality became extremely potent, because whatever is a manifestation of this, which is the source for all manifestation. It obviously loves persons. It's emanating persons by the gazillions. Humans, animals, celestial beings, our ancestors and nature spirits and so forth, deities. So I couldn't call that impersonal.
No.
The divine reality must somehow be supra-personal, meta-personal, the source of all persons, the substance of all persons.
Right.
One actor who's playing all the roles of all these souls, these individual, beautiful, very poignant beings, because on the personal consciousness level, the level of the soul, what in India used to be called the jiva, it's so poignant. So many bittersweet times and situations of loss, gain, poor health, radiant health.
Yeah,
sickness and death, as the Buddha reminded all listeners. The Buddha, incidentally, he didn't teach, when he spoke of anatta, the old Pali word, Buddhist Sanskrit, it's anatman. That doesn't mean no self or no person. It means that the aggregates of personhood, including the sense of being a me, a personal consciousness, these are not who I truly am. There's a common refrain in the Buddhist literature, the earliest Buddhist literature, the Pali Canon Sutta literature, where the Buddha, who often is referring to persons and, before this life and after this life, their karmic destiny and so forth, and he talks about different degrees of enlightened personhood. So he's talking about personhood all the time. He talks about how the absolutely boundless loving kindness, empathetic compassion, and sympathetic joy and peaceful equanimity before Brahma Viharas, the divine abodes, have these be spontaneously radiating from all beings, even apparently some of the worst characters in the cosmos, to be boundless metta, loving kindness, boundless karuna, deep empathetic compassion.
Would you say you use the notion of true self, which was a big part of my kind of first years with Neo-Advaita. And you mentioned a few minutes ago, I think you were saying, like, I've come to feel that the personal it's not all that you are. It's one part of what you are. So would you be comfortable saying that the personal is one limited aspect of your true self, but it's not the whole thing?
Exactly. Well put. And let's look just etymologically at the root of that word person. It comes from the old Greek per sonare, which means like literally sounding through. Sonare, it's like sound. Sony Corporation, it's for sound. Per, through. So, on the ancient Greek stage, the actors, actresses would hold up, and they usually held a little stick apparently to hold it up more easily, so they didn't have to go like that.
Yeah.
They had a mask and they would hold it up, and it was through that mask, that facade, literally face, through that face, that adopted face, they would sound the voice. So all persons throughout the cosmos, in whatever state of evolution, whatever kinds of karmic mix of tendencies they're carrying, good, evil, powerful, weak, and so forth, healthy, unhealthy, psychologically, spiritually speaking. All these persons are the faces, the instruments through which the divine is sounding its voice and enacting its intentions, its actions, its samskaras, its wholesome or unwholesome personal consciousness tendencies. So personhood is just a facet.
Right.
It's a face. And look at this, every night in deep dreamless sleep, there's no personhood for Jessica or for Timothy or any being that sleeps. Even dolphins, which don't sleep very much, this incredibly large brain, massively intelligent fellow persons we share the planet with. And of course, we're polluting the environment crazy and causing so many deaths. Cetacean populations of dolphins and whales. Dolphins only sleep a couple hours a night, apparently. Wow. But even then, any being that sleeps completely loses the personal consciousness. So we know that the personal consciousness is not absolute. It is not real in the ancient India sense of real, that which cannot be messed with, and that which is not merely phenomenal, subject to change, disappearance, waxing and waning. So the personal consciousness is not our absolute reality, but as an experiential reality for the absolute supra-personal divine one who is playing as each and every being we're so fortunate to meet, or that we are, quote, being in association with Jessica or Timothy or whomever, Donald Trump or Bibi Netanyahu over in Israel, all the beings of the cosmos, all the birds, the alien beings in interdimensional spaces, angelic beings and presences, they're all basically the one super-personal wearing what did Joseph Campbell call it? The mask of 1,000 faces or something. I forget his phrase.
I forget the exact terminology. One of the things that I noticed, and this is not what you mean, because I think, as I feel, you're saying everything is, and I like the word God, even though it has a lot of connotations, that everything is one of God's faces, as you said. But sometimes I think in some of the Neo-Advaita culture, and I really think of Neo-Advaita as a very reductionist model of reality and of non-duality. And they seem to suggest, they use these words of masks and appearances in a sort of a derogatory way, right? Like it's just a mask and we have to rip it off. And, I actually wanted to read that quote of yours that I just love so much, which was the Neo-Advaitans appear like a group of demolition wrecking crew, toppling all the beautiful buildings in the neighborhood and standing atop the rubble triumphantly. Because there's nothing else that can so succinctly do it, because that's exactly, I was one of those buildings, and you realize that it was a triumph and that this was what you were being taught to do. That's so hard to collapse all of this, but it's a tragic triumph in the end.
Yeah, like over 20, 25 years ago, I was warning different friends of mine who, psychotherapists, some of them healers, holistic health practitioners, but they become very smitten with certain celebrity teachers in the Neo-Advaita movement.
Yeah.
Which I start calling the Pseudo-Advaita.
I like that.
It doesn't honor any of the principles of the great traditions. And most of these figures who presume to be teaching, they know nothing about the tradition of which they purport to be like in the lineage of Ramana Maharshi. They don't have any clue what Ramana was actually like in person.
No.
And or any of the true Advaita sages and saints.
That's right.
Male and female. So, the problem is that, again, quite reductionistic, totally accurate with this perception, because everything gets reduced to this cut and dried unilevel context for interpretive life, and then they all get themselves in the straitjacket of speaking absolutish. I know this language. I was talking some of this language spontaneously at age 16. My mother would ask me when I'd come home from school after that huge awakening, that epiphany that was totally life-changing, woke me up out of much, some would say most, but I'll just say much of the selfishness of that silly boy who was just sports addicted. There's still a lot more, samskaras to be cleared out and wholesome samskaras to be developed. why the Chan and Zen Buddhist tradition, Song in Korea, Tien in Vietnam, they speak of, the best masters speak of the need for this direct, sudden awakening to our absolute, unborn, changeless, formless, pristine nature as pure, pure, pure spirit, awareness, open awareness, not an object, not any kind of phenomenon. This is the direct awakening to Buddha nature. This is not sufficient.
Right.
For the personal consciousness and the pragmatic level of truth, conventional truth, of multiplicity and interrelationships and duties and responsibilities, and then there's social justice or injustice, environmental justice or injustice. One has to not just have the sudden awakening to formless Buddha nature to really show that you are not just this little personal egocentric personal consciousness, soul, its limitations, and inability to often feel real profound empathy for fellow beings.
Right.
There needs to also be, in addition to the sudden awakening, this gradual cultivation. But now it happens in a more ego-free way, because you don't feel like you're the one trying to be a more loving being, trying to achieve some spiritual standard. It's more that it's realized that the Buddha nature, the divine identity, the self of all selves, the life, all animating life of all life, this is the power and the means by which all spiritual practices, dropping of unwholesome behavior and intentions, adopting, cultivating like a plant in a garden, on a farm. There needs to be nutrients. And then there's like this stupendous growth that occurs, by the power of sunlight and soil nutrients and a certain amount of precipitation, water, irrigation. You must know that in Israel, how, the settlers, kibbutz farms, they turned desert.
God. They had to irrigate the deserts, and it was quite an incredible feat.
Gardens in the desert, yeah, it's just
make the desert bloom.
And of course, it was ancient peoples that, with grazing their cattle and goats and sheep, that actually created so much erosion in desert, like the cedars of Lebanon.
Yeah.
Where are those cedars in Lebanon today?
It's amazing to think of there were forests, so many forests.
That speaks to an engaged spirituality, matter of social and environmental sentient being justice.
Sure does.
Getting off of meat and dairy, which are, the hooved locusts.
Yeah, I saw that you are very passionate
animals, but they've absolutely raised, they've leveled, they've denuded lands east and west, north, south, and destroying the planet, and are the major contributing factor, not just the deforestation and water overuse and pollution.
So many things.
Warming, prime emitters of the GHGs, the greenhouse gas.
It's incredible how many things there are, and how much we're being called on to be a part of that. And I can say from Neo-Advaita, there was very much that, of course, that over detachment, but there was this experience that I felt, and sometimes I can tap into it, where everything's kind of put into the context of infinity and this expansiveness with no borders. And then anything in the world, even if it's, world hunger or, war, it's like a blip, and you can turn it into minutia, like turning the telescope, upside down. And it's a way to bypass it. And when you use that, and I think Neo-Advaita sort of teaches that, I see it rendering people in those communities. It's really becomes very sort of a selfish path in a way. That this is how you can free yourself from the burden of needing to be involved. And they talk about impersonal love, and of course, I'm sure some of these people are actually giving and kind, not all of them.
It's their true nature. They can't help but radiate love if they give it a chance, and don't override it with this depersonalization ideology, which only succeeds in creating depersonalization syndrome. That's a pathology. It's not anything to boast about or
something that I suffered from when I was younger. Neo-Advaita somehow helped that in a strange way, because it's not really, there's the depersonalization with a positive affect in a way. But then I've heard of enlightenment's evil twin as the other kind of depersonalization, which is just harrowing. And that was sort of the end result of my days in Neo-Advaita. And I wanted to ask you, because you mentioned that sort of notion and experience of, perhaps, I don't know if you would say it this way, is there not being sort of a doer. And I was wondering if that is what you mean. How do you think that people can avoid that sense of like a loss of agency? Do you think it matters the teachings that you're involved with, and maybe the teachers? Because I know, like for myself, that sense of no doership sort of led to a no agency of like, there's nobody driving the bus, you know?
It brings up a paradox. And before I explore this more fully with you and any viewers, listeners you share this with,
hopefully.
Let's just get back for a moment to know what we mean by Neo-Advaita and Pseudo-Advaita.
That would be great.
When I spoke earlier, this unilevel contextualization of everything within, like, speaking absolutish. It goes back to, like, for instance, when I was 16 and my eyes just literally like almost bulging in my head. I just felt so alive for the first time in my life, so absolutely absent as this openness. It's the host for all living, and yet so fully present. And I just would really be fascinated by a person's whole aura and presence and look. And I knew that they were not the package. They were not the energies, the face, the body, the way they spoke. I knew they were this window onto God, who alone is the reality, the great reality, doing everything and being everyone. So, all the girls thought I was trying to come onto them. All the guys thought I was
like, wow, you're so beautiful.
And, I would, like, my parents, and even my younger sister, a year younger, she was already smoking joints and grass and getting high. I never smoked a thing, dropped anything. And they all thought I was on drugs.
I'm sure.
And I would have to come in and say, time out, just exploring, what is it? How miraculous that anything exists, that here we are. And that I get to see you, and we get to hear each other's voice and cherish one another. So one day my mom says, like, Timothy, was like at the dinner table, my sister sitting there. I think my dad was off at work. He ran his own literary agency in Hollywood, representing writers and directors and story editors and so forth. So he was probably working late on an assignment for some writer on their behalf, pitching into the studios or something, some project he'd written. So my dad's away, my mom's sitting there, and my sister's across from me. My mom says, so Timothy, how was school today? I said, there's only now. The past and the future, they're just concepts and memories. Don't you feel it, God's reality right now, Mom? Kathy, my sister, don't you feel only God is real at this moment? Well, surely you had like a math lesson today or English or something?
3 hours ago.
That's the past. It doesn't exist anymore. Now, here we are, miraculously together. Who's dreaming this up? Who's being all of us? That's the reality that's here. So it's so easy to just stop the world, stop the whole normal sense, the conventional sense, then the pragmatic sense of functioning with fellow beings in an environment. It's so easy, actually, to just stop everything mystically and just be awake to the formless absolute spirit, prior to and beyond the worlds, supra-personal, again, not impersonal, but not merely personal. So I had to learn to balance what I later found out within about 6 months, beginning to read some of the mystical literature from around the world, Christian mysticism, because I've grown up Catholic, And then, the mysticisms of the West, Jewish mysticism.
You mentioned the Baal Shem Tov, who
and
I love.
Moshe Cordovero and others before the Baal Shem Tov, Rabbi Israel Ben Eliezer, founded modern Hasidism in the early 1700s. Yeah, I mean, the Eastern mystics, the Buddha, the hundreds and hundreds of Buddhist sages in the ancient Vedanta texts, our oldest non-dual wisdom texts on the planet, the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, the Chandogya Upanishad, and those much shorter, pithier Upanishads that appeared within a few generations after, through the time of the Buddha and beyond, more Upanishads in the Bhagavad Gita. All of these texts are teaching two levels. The absolute truth of who is really here, the absolute reality, doing everything and being everyone. That's infinite, eternal, that is timeless, spaceless, being, awareness, bliss. So that's the absolute truth. Param Artika Satya, the absolute level truth. And there's a pragmatic level of multiple beings, sentient beings, and their interactions and behaviors and motivations and so forth. And this is all what, in those Eastern traditions, that explicitly distinguish between the two levels of truth. This pragmatic level truth is often described, translators will use the word conventional truth level. And that makes it sound kind of ordinary and mediocre and lesser. Absolute divine truth. But here's the real truth, the true Advaita, non-dual truth. Pragmatic truth is not any less than absolute truth. Because what gives rise to the manifest pragmatic level of beings and their interactions and worlds and events is the absolute.
It is that.
And so everything and everyone becomes sacred as a window for the absolute, but also an instantiation, an example of how the unmanifest manifests.
Manifests, yes.
This poignant moment, this particular poignant being.
I feel that as a divine immanence.
Precisely this.
Transimmanence is kind of the term that I've been liking, because it's not just the transcendent, where I think Neo-Advaita sort of stops. Then you bring that down into the world of form, and that's a whole nother level of realization that I think you can live in. And that's where, for me, the real poignancy and even in suffering has the bittersweet. I think this, I don't want in my life anymore. I don't want, let's say, a sense of joy that can only exist without sorrow. Something about the ability for them to be together. It's the most alive feeling that I've ever felt, and it's radical, but it's radical in a way that's like life. Bring it in, let it flow, and that's
pulsing.
Yeah, it's not about escaping anything.
No, it's not some zombie limbo land. I mean, the ancient Chan Buddhist masters of China, who later moved to Korea and became known as Song Buddhism, and then Zen in Japan in the 13th century with Dogen Zenji, Soto Zen tradition, and then a number of the masters of the sort of Linji tradition of China that started Rinzai Zen. These are the two main historical schools of Zen in Japan. In Japan especially, it was already there in a lot of Chinese Chan, but in Japanese Buddhism, they evolved this notion of wabi-sabi.
Makes me think of wabi.
Westerners will know this term because I found out that even like interior designers have adopted this term. It means, even Japanese will find it very difficult to translate this exactly. It has a lot of connotations, if not a precise denotation. Mm-hmm. Connotations of wabi-sabi are like the exquisite beauty of this which is aging, maybe flawed, perfectly imperfect.
That's it right there.
Manifesting all the exquisite bittersweet qualities of what it is for beings to have like shared this object, like an old piece of furniture, or like look at, you walk down the street, there's the young 18-year-old girl, radiant with flower-like initial blossoming beauty. But then there's like the 85-year-old woman with all these lines in her face and stoop. Her beauty of having lived that life of 85 years. I think she was a mother, a grandmother, changing her babies' diapers and nursing, the suffering, the worrying. Probably put those lines in the face earlier.
Right.
The exquisite beauty of this.
Yes.
This is wabi-sabi. The great Zen master, Rikyu, who's like one of the fathers of the art of Japanese tea ceremony. He purposely humbled the whole ceremony. He made it very intimate. He created these very small tea houses, and to kind of crawl inside to get there. And it was very spare in its adornment. And it was all about appreciating this fleeting moment when we get to be together. And his teaware, his cups and bowls, he purposely got them from a potter who worked with these drab colors and sometimes imperfections, because of the perfection, this imperfection, apparently imperfect.
Oh gosh, I love that.
Master Senno Rikyu, the Japanese tea master, it was all about celebrating the poignancy of this wabi-sabi perfection, spiritual perfection of the apparently imperfect within the relative realm, the realm of phenomena, beings, and relationships and events.
Right.
And there's such a profound sense of gratitude, the attitude of gratitude that gets spontaneously aroused with this notion of the supra-personal manifesting as all persons. Whereas if one holds the model that the absolute is somehow impersonal, then everything almost has to be an avoidance or a suppression of personhood and interpersonal relationships.
Yes.
That's disastrous. That's not spirituality.
Total disaster.
All the great spiritual masters have always had no problem speaking about personhood, and many of them would write or share verbally or dictate to some scribe autobiographical material, and they speak of their childhood and their mom and their dad, their siblings, things that led to their beginning and so forth. They don't try to pretend to be like these stoic zombies on atop the mountain or floating above the mountaintop.
Oh, that was me. I said I became like a bird trapped in the sky, which wasn't necessarily better than a bird trapped on the ground. But what you're saying about family is, I was listening to Rick Archer interviewing, and I won't mention who he interviewed. His name was one of the big head honchos of nobodiness. And he talked about
misinterpret when the Buddha meant what you truly are is not merely
exactly, and that's what they miss.
Anyway, I interrupted.
That's okay. No problem. So Rick was asking him, because this man had children. I hope they weren't too young, because he said, would your children and wife have noticed much of a difference in your behavior once your quote unquote, what this guy called his liberation, when he was no longer, and became nobody and blah, blah, blah. And he said, well, no, but yes, because there were no more children. There was no more father. There were no more games being played. And at that point, I just was, oh my God, these poor children. Right. It is just such an avoidance. And it's just, I mean, why even say such things?
It's a pathology. Again, it comes from imbalanced notion of what spiritual life is. And, my heart goes out to that man, that he come more fully into the true heart, the hridayam, the true heart of reality, the true self of all selves. Because when you truly awaken to the transcendent spontaneously, if this awakening to transcendence is authentic, spontaneously it manifests as complete sense of immanence and re-engagement with all beings. I mean, one of my teachers, Sri Nisargadatta, whom I had the good fortune to see about 8 months before he dropped the body, he made it very clear to us one day, just a handful of us gathered there, and he said, spirituality is like a 2-step dance. Full disidentification, spontaneously followed by full re-identification with all beings.
It's paradox.
And, elsewhere he's said things like, the famous saying, I mean, I heard it one way. He actually said it while I was there in those 10 very decisive days where I'd come see him morning and night, not just for the talks, but the bhajan sessions, which is where he really was alive and, amazing. There are all sorts of energies happening. And you could tell this is where he really lit up. It wasn't even the talks that most people kind of glom onto. It was all the beyond the mere talks, living expression, chanting these old hymns from Gyaneshwar, the 13th century medieval Marathi non-dual sage of non-dual wisdom, non-dual devotion. Sri Nisargadatta was very alive with these kind of hymns and tradition of fully transcendent, fully immanent, fully disidentified, fully identified kind of spirituality. But one of those occasions, he said that kind of in the flip order of the way that people know it from the I Am That collection of quotes of dialogues of Sri Nisargadatta. He said, wisdom says I am nothing. Love says I am everything.
I do know that.
It's clear that as the absolute is always freely adopting personhood for the sake of interpersonal interaction. It's all Leela, it's all spontaneous play. There's no neediness to it. There's no gap. There's no fragmentation. It's all just spontaneous personing from our supra-personal nature.
What I sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
That quote has had a lot of relevance to my path, and that quote is often cited among the Neo-Advaitas who tend to cherry pick different things for their different agendas. And I think because for me on that path, it was very much, now I'm everything, now I'm nothing, but I was never somebody or something anymore. So I always think to myself, now, what about the somebody in between? But perhaps he meant that everything encompassed each thing, so that I am everything, including this thing.
Exactly.
And maybe people misunderstand that.
Yeah, non-duality or Advaita means basically inclusiveness.
Right.
You are the absolute, open, infinite host, formless capacity for all worlds and beings and experiences and relationships, and you are each of these beings.
Right, because it's also
precious, so irreplaceable, so
exactly
exquisitely wabi-sabi suchness, the suchness of the individual. It's suchness where it comes from Buddhist Sanskrit, and later again Chinese and Japanese. They just be so eloquent about a tree that had lost all of its leaves for the fall, winter. Some would say, oh, look at that barren, dried up looking, dead looking tree. But the exquisite suchness of that moment for that tree. And then knowing deep down, not 100% sure, but trusting that in spring, it would be richly in foliage again. In bloom.
And your heart is still touched by its isness. Each thing, no matter what, if it's a garbage can or a sunset, there can each be sort of tenderness for that. And that really changed as well.
That was the wholeness and completeness of that initial set of awakenings when I was 16, is the most mundane things and situations just were bursting and overflowing with a sense of sacred power and glory.
Would you say more significant?
Like the old upholstery on this old chair in my bedroom where I would sit and do my homework, when I wasn't at a writing desk. at the writing desk. I actually bought a little magnifying glass because sometimes the bugs would work their way around the screens if they were slightly bent in a late spring evening or something. They'd come in, they'd alight on the desk, and I'd get out from the drawer carefully, silently. I'd get the magnifying glass so I could look in their bug eyes.
Oh, wow.
Have a sense of like,
be
what's
in awe.
being you?
Yeah, wow. That's so beautiful. Yeah.
So yes, exactly what you're saying, Jessica, this individuality, the exact exquisiteness of a being within this space-time play and the whole psychological, spiritual play of cellular evolution of what souls are undergoing, sometimes very painful,
right,
sometimes very beautiful and pleasurable.
Right.
The dance is so exquisite.
It is. It is.
I really so profoundly dramatic.
Sorry, what did you say was profound?
The moments and the situations are so profoundly dramatic. I mean, right now in the United States, as you may know, we've had 2 mass killings within 2 weeks. A bunch of little school children, 10 years old, most recently, by an 18-year-old gunman. And then, what was it, 10 days before, another 18-year-old gunman, a real white supremacist, ranting mad boy. He wasn't a man yet, he was a mad boy, spouting all this great replacement theory that people like Tucker Carlson and others spout on Fox News, another Rupert Murdoch-owned organ for destroying the planet, destroying nations, destroying love for the sake of power and profits and greed.
Sounds like Neo-Advaita.
Yeah, they're not dissimilar. They both come from the authoritarian personality.
That's right.
Robert Altemeyer, amazing American psychologist, going back to what a number of Jewish, non-Jewish psychologists, psychiatrists were trying to figure out in the aftermath of World War II. How did the Holocaust happen? How could you get neighborhood grocers and engineers and truck drivers to pick up guns and slay their fellow citizens, their neighbors, their Jewish neighbors?
Can we possibly understand it? Yeah.
Homosexuals, the so-called undesirables that Hitler basically gave them the green light to slaughter all of them in the final solution. Now, how could that happen? And Altemeyer resurrected the work of some of these psychologists from the late 40s, early 1950s, who had been kind of put on the shelf by other psychologists who thought, well, their methodology wasn't precise enough. But Altemeyer came along in the late 80s, 90s. Since then, he's written a number of books. You can read his big book for the lay person, the non-professional mental health professional, all about the authoritarian personality. It basically sees everything in black and white terms. You're with us or against us.
Exactly.
There's a real strong sense of we are the privileged, the chosen ones.
Yes.
You, the outsider, unless you join us, you are the enemy. And then invoking divine punishment for the enemy, and then feeling, well, I can be the instrument of God's divine punishment here, and executions and massacres and pogroms and all the ugliness. You can trace almost all the wars and massacres and rapes and brutality to the authoritarian personality type, mixed with things like the malignant narcissistic personality disorder.
And you see that in some of the Neo-Advaita circles, right?
You very much see it.
It's a bit on a symbolic level that I think it would, maybe on your website you mentioned the Heaven's Gate cult, the Heaven's Gate suicide cult.
Yeah,
and I had recently thought to myself that, I'm talking about some of but Neo-Advaita does, for me, it's a reference to the most extreme, but that it's sort of a symbolic suicide cult. It's an ego side. And, it's assisted suicide because that's, they're coaxing you to do that, and they're shaming you for not wanting to do it and praising you for doing it. And it's quite frightening.
There's a lot of bullies in the movement.
There's so much bullying.
On a school playground dealing with bullies, oppressing, persecuting for not measuring up what they want from you. So this is a pathology, and so we have infinite compassion for beings that are afflicted with this. Hopefully they outgrow it sooner than later, and by the divine grace and power, the one Shakti, divine power, they will awaken because it's unnatural. It feels dead. It feels overly controlled and emptied out of any juice.
It does.
Any aliveness.
Humanness.
Exactly.
I think that maybe you're right, because more people, I think this conversation is starting to happen more lately. And I am curious, just perhaps on a positive note, not that you and I haven't been positive, but I've been asking this a lot, is what can be done about this? Do you think it's just a matter of having the conversations and putting them out there and spreading awareness? I'm not sure if there's anything else that I could potentially put my efforts into that would be more direct. I'm not sure.
Well, I think whatever is moving you to allow the real healing and making whole of the teaching of the Dharma, the ancient truth about phenomena, and this noumenon prior to all phenomena, and each phenomenon in particular exquisite in its suchness. Any movement to share and inspire fellow beings is a great good. And we can, in our heart, just feel, all the forces of healing, just healing these imbalances and these forms of stunted spiritual perception or realization. So, what Robert Altemeyer wrote, again, the book about like the right-wing authoritarian personality syndrome, and all the papers and other more technical books he's written for professionals. He basically thought that authoritarians would outgrow their authoritarianism if they were simply in the company of non-authoritarian type human beings who could role model for them in their speech and language and gestures and body language, how it is to be an empathetic, humble, open-hearted, open-minded being who doesn't think in rigid categorical terms, but is open to, feeling out situations from different points of view. I think of Anandamayi Ma, the great 20th century Divine Mother type incarnation. There was a number of them. I was thinking Sri Ramakrishna back in the 1800s had something to do with that. He invoked the presence of the Divine Mother so strongly, suddenly you started getting all these female saints and sages show up in India, elsewhere. It's documented in books like that, Women of Power and Grace, and the much larger project, more like an encyclopedia from which it originated. I put it online finally, called Women of Spirit, Saints, Teachers,
I'm going to read that.
Goddesses and whatever it is, East and West. It's a free online collection. Anyhow, Anandamayi Ma, one of the great manifestations of that beautiful Divine Mother energy of the 20th century, she would often, when people would ask her a question, she would say, well, like from one perspective, you could say this about, say, the problem of suffering. But from another perspective, you could say maybe something different like this. Even, from this perspective, and she might mention a certain tradition of Indian spirituality, you could see it like this. So she was always role modeling what it's like to be fluid, open, soft, yielding like the Tao of ancient China, and not, a rigid
it has to be
person that wants to win arguments and
topple the buildings
or whatever.
It's
utterly delightful.
It is
anyone who is in the flow of their divine nature and just manifesting these lovely virtues of kindness, integrity, humor, good cheer.
And self-compassion, I believe, is where it begins. And a lot of I think if a teacher or a guide doesn't have the self-compassion, then of course they're not going to be able to offer that to someone else.
No, and they again will resort to kind of authoritarianism and or gamesmanship, one-upsmanship tactics to always feel like they're the one holding the power in the relationship. There's in these characterizations that happen, I call them characterizations, like the one divine actor playing a particular character in a movie on stage, which is what life is. The one suprapersonal divine playing as each and every person. Some of these characters get kind of crusty, rigid. They feel insecure and so need to bolster themselves with certain stratagems. They have certain ambitions to have a lot of power, because deep down in the psyche, there's a feeling like, if I don't have a lot of power, I won't survive.
Right.
Or I won't get the goodies that I want. And there's usually a lot of desire and fear at the root. There's a desire for control over others and being looked up to, and desire for pleasures, usually of the quite material kind, and self-gratifying kind. No empathy for others and what they go through. Like in some of these organizations, the cult leader has a whole bunch of sycophant slaves, basically, serving their every whim, providing free labor, or minimally compensated, but with lots of weird trappings and pressures and stresses, and it's all for the sake of serving the great pseudo-guru or God figure or whatever it is. You see this because people have shared so much with me about their own adventures and misadventures and spiritual exploration. I've just heard all the horror stories from the large group awareness trainings in the more secular venue, like Werner Erhard and Est, which became Landmark Forum.
That's right.
Like LifeSpring and others. Nexium, all of these horror shows that have occurred in the secular kind of pop psychology or pop spirituality. And then, the ones that presume to be carrying the mantle of great traditions of Buddhism or Hinduism or all the Christian cults, that think they're being totally obedient to Jesus.
That's right.
It's just a nightmare that's being created.
Yeah.
Almost all of them are fueled by these deep down desires of the cult leader and those that want to be close to the source of power so they can socially also be powerful within the group, and have the edge, be one up over all the underlings. So there's all this desire, and deep down underneath the desire, it's fear that we can't just be in an egalitarian way and share and trust one another and serve one another with no expectation for reward.
Exactly.
Just the joy of service, So these are the things that occur, these root dynamics out of fear, greed, and they need not happen.
Yeah. But bringing more of that underside, I think, is really important, because it also, having the empathy and the compassion for, obviously those people have core wounding as well that's making them this way. The more we understand it, I think the better it is that we can disentangle from it. And the people that who go to these egoless egomaniacs have their own needs that they're trying to fill, that is sort of dysfunctional ways of doing it. So it's
often what's going on there is that people seek out situations that feel familiar as when they were children in a dysfunctional family. They're looking again for the stern, angry father or the punitive mother figure, whatever it might be, and they feel a resonance with a particular dysfunctional cult leader. Because deep down, subconsciously, and on a karmic level, they're trying to get straight and get clear of what really traumatized them when they were young. So they'll, feeling wounded, they seek out these beings who are going to wound them further in some kind of half-conscious attempt to get reconciled with their own past.
The repetition compulsion.
Weird energy of fear and desire and oppression. And so it's like playing out dysfunctional roots. And notice how I mentioned dysfunctional cult leaders. The very word cult is usually misunderstood. It comes from an old Latin root, cultus, which means any gathering around a perceived source of grace, spiritual power, goodness. And where cults become problematic is when they become very psychologically dysfunctional.
Right.
I've got a phone call going, getting ready for this big move of location. There's all sorts of things, and I forgot to.
I'll let you go in a minute. Don't worry.
Anyhow, so, like the movement, the gathering around the Buddha was a cult. Mm-hmm. The movement gathering around Jesus or Rabbi Hillel in ancient Israel was a cult. Yeah. But these were positive cults by and large. You can evaluate cults in terms of how functional and positive of beautiful growth and unfolding of the personal consciousness. How beautiful is it, or how nasty and gnarly and damaging and wounding is it? So I don't just call something a cult. I want to distinguish between what's a beautiful, empowering cult that will bring healing and growth and beautiful qualities and virtues, especially the virtues. By their fruits ye shall know them. The fruits are the virtues. We call the Buddha, or some great saint, we call that person a saint because of the beautiful ways in which the personal consciousness had been cultivated, like a beautiful garden of incredible growing virtuous flowers and fruits and so forth. Whereas a dysfunctional cult is where beings are being wounded and oppressed and unnecessary stresses and traumas are afflicting them from the strange forms of belligerent, oppressive, exploitative leadership.
Seems where the shadows are playing out.
You can kind of smell the fragrance of one kind of group and the stench of another kind of group.
Amazing.
And the stench, we're saying Neo-Pseudo-Advaita groups, comes with this kind of heartlessness and certain smug, derisive quality.
Yeah.
It's sad. It's a sad thing, and it can be healed.
It can be. I mean, I'm working on it, and I mean, I'm surprised I'm here today that I've survived to tell the tale metaphorically. But no, it's true, and you bring up so many important points, and that distinction between the functional and dysfunctional cult. I found what you wrote there about the criteria for cults, going through them was, oh my God, some of these, there's a spectrum, but Neo-Advaita is somewhere on that spectrum for each one of them. And so I plan to share that with people. And I think that's going to be really helpful. Yeah.
The bottom line is that there can be trust, the breath can let go. There need not be stress of this sort. Life itself is stressful enough. Textbook definition of stress: any situation or relationship, encounter, that there's this consciousness, fully conscious or pre-conscious or subconscious, that one doesn't have enough time, energy, resources, or know-how to meet the demands of the situation.
Right, yeah.
And so the mind gets a little wigged out. I call the mind, incidentally, it's not a bogeyman. We don't have to ridicule the mind and say, oh, the ego mind. No, the mind is like this incredible, whimsical, almost like a cartoon figure.
It's miraculous.
Movie with CGI. The mind is like this neurotic guardian angel. It's trying to help. It's trying to smooth the situations and prepare for the future in a sensible way and so forth. But it's often blowing it. It doesn't have enough knowledge. It doesn't have enough power to execute and enact what might need to be enacted. So we don't have to be so hard on ourselves. You mentioned earlier self-compassion. I remember a dear old mystical sage from Scandinavia who wound up living in India for 45 years, Emanuel Sorensen. He began to be nicknamed Shunyata. Shunyata. It was actually a name he adopted, but others quickly called him that. It means the vast openness or emptiness, but that's not a good translation of that old Buddhist word, openness. He had a little pin that said Mr. Nobody. The Alan Watts Society discovered him living in a hill station hermitage up in North India and brought him over to the US to teach. He said, I have nothing to teach. They said, just share your silence. And Shunyata was a beautiful being. He met Ramana Maharshi a few times and was so androgynous. He was like male, female energies incarnate. He had these beautiful blue eyes and wore this turban and robes. And people who met him after they brought him over the West, many thought he was a woman, but he was just this gentle Scandinavian man who'd met Rabindranath Tagore in a garden party where Shunyata was tending a big wealthy person's garden. He was the gardener. And Rabindranath Tagore met him at a garden party and took a look at him and said, "You're a mystic. You ought to come to India." So he did. He met Ramana Maharshi, stayed for like 45 years. Some friends of mine up in the San Francisco Bay Area put together a couple of books on Shunyata, Emmanuel Sorensen. And he had a wonderful way of working with words. So, for instance, if someone mentioned like, "Oh, I have all these ego troubles," he would say, ego G. And you know, the G, the J-I on the end, it's like what we would say with Swamiji or Babaji. It's a term of endearment and respect.
I see, yeah.
He knew how difficult it is to be associated as the absolute, to be associated with the personal consciousness. All the stresses and traumas and needs, unmet needs, like people that don't have enough food, like right now, most of the people in Afghanistan are starving to death, you know. So, ego G, that word itself will shift everything about how you contextualize this matter of the soul, the personal consciousness, the me.
Yeah.
It's not a set of phenomena to be denigrated.
No.
Yes, there are certain egocentric tendencies to be outgrown, but there need not be this whipping oneself or whipping other people.
No.
There can be this trust that we can be largely free of selfish tendencies and then just celebrating the selves of each other.
I love that. I love that.
Jessica self and so on.
Yeah, and I find that when the Timothy and the Jessica self are held with that divine immanence, and we're an expression of that, somehow it opens me to more self-compassion, because I see it as, I like the word God again, that it's also God's struggles. And so can I hold God as well in my heart as God struggles? And yeah, it's been a huge shift. And
let's look at it squarely. You know, God is the sufferer, the experiencer of all the intensities, much of which gets called pain, some of which gets called pleasure, but much of which gets called pain. The intensity is on an organismic level of the body-mind. And, you know, here's the thing. I know there's a field in the development of Western theology called process theology, where it says God is with us in the pain. But process theology is very poor. I mean, it basically eliminates the transcendence of the superpersonal divine. I mean, the absolute glory of a divinity that can come up with a physical cosmos, nearly 14 billion years old, and you know, with planets like this that have so much life on them. Whereas most of the cosmos, it's actually just hydrogen and helium. These amazing super clusters of galaxies and black holes and everything, quasars. The intelligence that can come up with this is profound, and it must emanate straight from the absolute transcendence. So process theology misses the glory of God, but it's trying to get in here with a more personable sense of God, that God is like right here with us in the suffering. But process theology is wrong, because it misses not only the transcendence, but the full immanence. Anyone who's experiencing anything right now, pleasurable or painful, is God as you experiencing this.
That's exactly right.
God is who you are.
Yeah.
Both in your transcendent nature, beyond all, like the people that experience near-death experiences, they immediately lift beyond the body. They pop beyond the body and feel instantly pain-free. Like an American Jewish rabbi, Hasidic rabbi, Menachem Gershom, he wrote books like, I think, From Ashes to Healing. He was very curious about Holocaust victims, you know, those who had been put to death on the death marches and in the gas chambers and so forth, gunned down in the shtetl and so forth by machine gun fire by the Nazi troops. He was curious, how some of those souls that left their Jewish bodies might have taken on Caucasian bodies. I'm sorry, Gentile bodies is what I meant. And like, in America, because he found people would come to his talks about rebirth, reincarnation, which is openly taught in Kabbalah and Hasidism.
Yeah, it is.
And he really strongly suspected that some of these people were reborn souls from those who had perished during the Nazi Holocaust. So he began to get hypnotherapists, and then he himself got a license in hypnotherapy to do it himself, some of these past life regression therapy sessions. And, people like say in 1942 or 44 or 45 might have just been experiencing the most harrowing, ungodly, in the almost literal sense of that word, situations in these camps and on the death marches, or, one weeps just thinking of it. But Gershom, this Rabbi Yonasan Gershom, he found out that, certainly when he himself was doing the sessions, but he would witness and record the sessions with other hypnotherapists when he'd bring these clients to them for a past life experience to see if that was part of their experience, that they were Holocaust victims. As soon as the being would rise up out of the body at death, they were instantly pain-free, no longer cold, no longer hungry, no longer fearing the Nazi oppressor. It was all bliss, all the most stupendously lit up light in the clear light of God. They were an absolute exquisite joy.
Yeah.
And so each of us is this amazing combination of the absolute divinity, single, utterly single, and also a totally lit up, illuminated, purely emanated soul in perpetual bliss. And we are souls associating with the body mind. And notice I didn't say incarnating, because we're not literally incarnate, in the meat. From the old Latin and like Spanish root, carne means meat. An incarnation would literally mean that it's a soul who is somehow in the body and kind of trapped in the meat. But no, the soul associates with the body. And you prove that every night in dreams, because you have a dream body. You're not in your physical body in your dream experience. You're in some kind of subtle realm with a subtle body or form that's cavorting about in subtle realm environments, not in your bedroom or wherever you park the body to put it to sleep.
Yeah.
So we know experientially we're not just trapped in the meat.
No.
We're not persons just trapped inside a human incarnation or an animal incarnation like our pets and all the billions of animals put through the real Holocaust of what goes on in the feedlots and slaughterhouses. Incidentally, I'm aware that Israel has like the highest per capita number of vegans of any nation.
Tel Aviv is basically a vegan city. It's really surprising. And Timothy, I want to be conscious because it says we have a minute and a half left, and I know that you have some things to get to. So I know if you
imagine you're busy. It's later at night now in Tel Aviv.
It's not too late, but because I know we'll have to log in again when that ends. So I guess we could bring it together, and I would love to sort of just put out a wish for all beings to awaken to divine immanence. And I hope that people like you and I can help others to discover the difference between healthy and dysfunctional spirituality, specifically non-duality. And I just have so much appreciation for you and all that you've written and being here with me.
Oh, you're welcome, Jessica. We'll trust that the God self of each self will wake people up. We may be instruments or not for more of the spread of the true non-duality, but it doesn't matter. We're instruments.
Yeah.
And, but I salute you, Jessica. I bow down in all directions to your omnipresent nature.
You as well.
Be well.
Here's a virtual hug.
I'm feeling it.
Okay.
You're a manifestation of love and light, and kindness and compassion. Crystal radiance.